like sunshine, like springtime, like something's in the water and I'm taking a deep dive. I'm feeling so weightless, like I'm gonna make it, and nothing in the universe can take this. I can see it clearly now, nothing gonna bring me down. I got my head held high, I'm on my way, and I'm following the signs to my happy place. I'm walking in the light of a brand new day, and I'm right where I belong in my happy place. I got my head held high, I'm on my way, and I'm following the signs to my happy place. I'm walking in the light of a brand new day, and I'm right where I belong in my happy place. And I'm right where I belong in my happy place. And I'm right where I belong in my happy place.
Thank you for joining the show and welcome to the Yonglou Lin School of Medicine Healthy Longevity webinar. We have a very interesting speaker, Herman Pontzer, tonight, and he's going to tell us all about what it means for hunter-gatherers to have a happy place. But before we go to that, we're going to have one of our graduate students, Dong Lu, talk about a recent paper in the field.
Hi, everyone. As Brian already mentioned, my name is Dong Lu. I'm a PhD student in Prof Brian Kennedy's lab. Today, I will be talking about this paper published last year on developmental cell. HLH30 TFAB is a master regulator of reproductive quiescence. The animal model of interest here was C. elegans, which is the commonly studied worm model in aging field. And this was this very interesting state that this group of scientists were looking at, reproductive quiescence, ARD. ARD stands for adult reproductive diapause, which is a state of reproductive quiescence that forms in response to late-level food deprivation. We can look at the figure on the right-hand side. The upper figure shows us how the normally grown worm will look like. They were exposed to unrestricted food intake, while the lower figure shows us how the ARD worms look like. We can see that the ARD worms appear much smaller, cuddled together in distorted posture. They appear as if they are sleeping. They still retain all the adult features of the normally fed worms. They were able to live months without food, and by refeeding, giving them bacterial food again, they were able to be rejuvenated. Interestingly, these ARD worms, upon recovery, were still able to produce healthy offspring. However, the physiological and molecular requirements for entry, maintenance, and exit of ARD in worms were still unknown, because the main roadblock was the absence of systematic method to induce ARD in worms. Thus, this group of scientists in the first place has been investigating how to induce ARD synchronously. They found out by starvation in mid-L3 developmental stage of the worms were able to induce ARD in large cohorts. Let's see how the results look like on the right-hand side. With ARD induction, the white-type worms were able to achieve a huge increase in the lifespan. And this life-extending effect was even more pronounced at suboptimal temperature at 15 Celsius degree. Upon recovery, these worms were able to produce embryos, and majority of the worms still retain the reproductive potential. They were able to give birth to an average of 15 progeny per worm. So one might be wondering, what are the factors and mediators behind ARD? This group of scientists has zoomed into this factor called HLH30, the worm ortholog of TFAB. TFAB is called transcription factor in EB in human beings. It is a conserved muscular regulator of lysosome biogenesis, fat and mitochondrial metabolism, and autophagy. To different extents, TFAB has been shown to be required in all the non-major longevity pathways. It's able to promote life extension through these pathways. Let's see how this group of scientists has been investigating HLH30 in the reproductive quiescence state. They have used HLH30 mutant worms to be compared to N2 wild-type worms. Both of the genotypes were able to enter ARD successfully. However, the mutation only has a great effect with the ARD worms, as shown from the right top hand corner of the slides. We could see that this mutation has caused a huge reduction of 88% in the mean lifespan of the ARD worms. But this mutation has only a minor effect by 12% reduction for the worms that didn't go through ARD and were normally fed. This reveals that HLH30 is essential for ARD and is a major player. This is consistent with the rapid nuclear localization of HLH30 factor within 2 hours after ARD induction. Let's see how the worms look like under microscope for the ARD state. We could see that the mutant worms has an enlarged nuclei in their germ cells, and the cells appear much more cellularized and often apoptotic or necrotic compared to the wild-type ARD worms. At the same time, the mutant worm also exhibited reduced oxygen consumption, and their fats dissipated rapidly within ARD induction, compared to the wild-type and the worms that didn't enter ARD. As a result, majority of the mutant worms remain arrested after 2 days of ARD and upon refeeding, and very few worms actually recovered from the ARD state and be able to produce progeny again. In a nutshell, HLH30 is absolutely essential for ARD, whether TFAB and its orthologs and related molecules play similar roles in other animals or quiescent states still remain an interesting question to be found out. At the same time, in the future, targeting TFAB may provide novel opportunity for improved health and longevity. Here is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you. As I've said before, we have a new Center for Asian Center for Reproductive Longevity and Equality as part of our Healthy Longevity program here in the U.S. And Donglu is one of the scientists working on that. So we'll hear more about reproductive aging in the future. Tonight, and before I start, by the way, please use your Q&A button to ask questions, and Jorming will come in at the end of the talk tonight and ask those questions for you. Tonight we have Herman Pontzer, who's an associate professor of evolutionary anthropology at Duke University, and his research focuses on energy metabolism, life history, and health in humans and other primates. His first book just came out recently. It's called Burn, so I expect everyone to go online and find that after the show. And the topic of his talk tonight is Healthy as a Hunter-Gatherer, Diet, Activity, and Energetics in Humans. Herman, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to join you. I'm going to go ahead and put my talk up. I'll talk about some of the material that we cover in Burn. So that's exciting and fun for me. And just as a matter of disclosure, I'll mention that, a lot of the, like I said, a lot of the material that we'll cover in the talk is in Burn today. So I'm an evolutionary anthropologist. I've done a lot of work with hunter-gatherers over the past decade or so, and I'm interested in how the human body evolved and how our past shapes our present and how our bodies work today. I am interested in hunter-gatherers not only because they provide a sort of window into our past, but because they're also incredibly healthy. They're really amazing models for public health. People who live in hunting and gathering societies today, they don't have any obesity, they don't have type 2 diabetes, they don't have heart disease. They have actually quite good life expectancy if they get through childhood. I've got a lot of infectious disease in childhood, but they actually
have
long, healthy lives.
To interrupt you, I don't think your slides are being shared right now.
Oops, I'm sorry. Is that better now?
Yep, you're up. Good.
All right, great. Sorry. Anyway, so again, just as a matter of disclosure, a lot of the material I'll cover today is in the book. But as I said, hunter-gatherers are incredibly healthy, and they have long health spans, as well as being free from many of the non-communicable diseases that we suffer from in the industrialized world. And since I'm here talking to a group interested in longevity, I'll mention that they are incredibly healthy and healthy weight over a long lifespan. So we have participants in our studies with the Hadza hunter-gatherer group, I'll talk about a bit more in a minute, who we have up into their 70s and 80s, and they maintain healthy weights throughout that lifespan. So their weights are in a healthy range and consistent and stable throughout their adult lives. They're also incredibly active, and they don't have issues of sort of frailty, or for that matter, they don't develop hypertension in the same way that we do in the industrialized world. So here's step counts per day, and here are Hadza women. And you can see each dot here is a woman's a day recorded for women, for a woman. And you can see the average is about 12,000 steps a day. And it doesn't really start to diminish until really in the later decades. And even then stays, very near 10,000 steps a day on average. Men's steps per day is even higher. Walking speeds are quite high and stay high throughout life. Hypertension remains at really low rates, even in older ages here. So really good models for healthy aging, really good models for sort of long health spans with a Hadza. And, we can imagine then that what's the secret to the Hadza success? Why are they so healthy into their later decades? And we've been focused, no surprise, I suppose, on how activity and diet and energy expenditure are shaping these aspects of health. And so that's been my focus the last, decade or so, is focusing on metabolism, activity, and diet with the Hadza and other hunting and gathering and other subsistence sort of traditional populations, asking how energy expenditure and diet vary among these groups and how it seems to be related to their health. And so I'll talk about that today. I'll start off by talking about the Hadza Energetics Project, which was my foray into this work. And this is work I did with David Reichland and Brian Wood. So just to give you, again, a sort of more sort of a snapshot of life for the Hadza. The Hadza are a hunting and gathering population who live in northern Tanzania. They live in this sort of dry savanna habitat. Women gather plant foods each day. Men hunt for game each day. They get a lot of physical activity to do that. They don't have any domesticated crops or domesticated animals or vehicles or machines or electricity or plumbing. They live in grass houses on the savanna. And so men hunt here with bow and arrow that they make themselves. So, they're modern humans, just like everybody on the planet is today. But because they hold on to this old traditional lifestyle, they give us a chance to ask what that lifestyle does to our bodies. Of course, humans have been, hunting and gathering for 2.5 million years until very, very recently, when industrialization changed our way of life. So this hunting and gathering lifestyle is actually sort of the ecologically normal lifestyle for humans. And it's a good way to ask how the human body can age in these more ecologically relevant lifestyles. Okay. So one of the first things we wanted to ask when we did this work with the Hadza was how physical activity affects energy expenditure. Because, of course, one of the ideas that is really prominent, and you still see it in public health guidelines, is that if we are really physically active each day, high levels of physical activity, maybe we'll burn more calories than if we're sedentary. And those extra calories we burn will help keep our body composition in a healthier place. It'll help us keep fat off, right? And help us stay healthy. And so we know that the Hadza are much more physically active than those of us in the industrialized world. Here's a snapshot of that. 5 to 10 times more physical activity each day for a Hadza man or woman than a man or woman in the industrialized world. And so we can ask, how much more energy will they burn every day compared to people in the industrialized world, or Westerners for that matter? And so here's a Hadza man drinking an isotopically enriched dose of water. We measure these energy expenditures using a technique called the doubly labeled water technique. And if you're not familiar with that, I'm happy to answer questions about it after the talk. But basically, it's an isotope tracking technique that allows us to measure the body's production of carbon dioxide. So it's the gold standard technique for measuring calories burned per day outside of a laboratory setting. Your body can't make CO2 without burning calories. You can't burn calories without making CO2. So by tracking carbon dioxide production, CO2 production, it gives us a really precise measurement and strongly validated measurement of energy expenditure in free living populations. So these are the first measurements of daily energy expenditure for a hunting and gathering group. And we took all these measurements for Hadza men and women, and we compared them to men and women in the US, Europe, Japan, a lot of other industrialized populations. And here's what those data look like. It was a real surprise. So every dot here is a man or woman. The men are closed symbols, the open symbols are women. Hadza are red. Market economies, industrialized economies are gray. And as you can see, right, as we get larger and larger, fat-free mass is your body weight minus your fat weight. As people get bigger, they burn more calories, so energy expenditure goes up as people get larger. But you notice the Hadza are in the same space as the industrialized population. So there's no difference in daily expenditure between the Hadza and people in the US, Europe, other industrialized populations. That was a big surprise. And I'm showing this to you in a sort of bivariate manner, energy expenditure against fat-free mass. But in fact, if you run more complex models, including age, body composition, et cetera, you don't see any effect of population. So there's the same energy expenditure between the Hadza and industrialized groups. That was a huge surprise because, again, they're 5 to 10 times more physically active. So it's a real shock that they could be burning the same number of calories as you and me. Well, I should say that we measured this using a different technique as well to make sure it wasn't just the technique. We used heart rate monitoring and found the same answer. So the Hadza, we can say confidently, are burning the same number of calories as people in industrialized countries. But, well, maybe it's just the Hadza, right? Such a surprising result. We need to check against other groups and see if we can replicate it. And there aren't a whole lot of other populations who live like this still, but we've been able to replicate this in a couple of other populations. And I'll talk about those now. So the next group I'll talk about is the Schwarz. These are forager horticulturalists, so they do some wild foods. They also do a little bit of simple farming. They live in the Amazonian rainforest in Ecuador, in South America. And this is work done and led by Sam Urlacher, who's now a professor at Baylor. He was a postdoc in my lab when he did this work. And Sam was particularly interested in energy expenditure in children. Of course, childhood obesity is a big issue, and so a big focus in our lab and others. So Sam was able to measure activity levels, resting energy expenditure, and total energy expenditure in Schwarz children. And just to give you a sense, no surprise, he found that activity levels were higher with Schwarz children than they are in industrialized populations. Here, the comparator is Canada, but this would be true across other populations as well. Sam also found that basal metabolic rate, so that's the energy expenditure when you're completely at rest, lying down quietly in the morning. Basal energy expenditures are also higher for Schwarz children than for industrialized children, so industrialized population children. So here, every dot is a child. Red is Schwarz, blue is industrialized. And this is, again, I'm showing you these against fat-free mass because that's the strongest sort of single predictor of energy expenditure is the size of your fat-free mass, your lean mass. But again, we run these with more complex models, including age and sex and et cetera, and we don't see any, in this case, we do see a big difference. Basal metabolic rate's much higher in Schwarz children. And we think that elevation, if you ask how much higher, what explains that elevated basal metabolic rate, it seems to be related to immune function. And so here's a measure of immune function, immunoglobulin G, in dried blood spots. And you can see it's as children have more and more evidence of immune system activity, which is what this cytokine is telling you is how active the immune system is to fight bacteria or parasites, that BMR becomes more and more elevated. And so we think that elevated BMR is due to immune function. But in any case, whether it's immune function or something else or other factors are involved, these children have high activity levels. They have high basal metabolic rates. And so we should certainly expect then, right, that they would have high total daily energy expenditures. And in fact, what we see is similar to what we saw with the Hadza, that daily energy expenditure, the total calories burned per day, and I should say these are week-long measurements. So it isn't just sort of a one-day kind of thing, one-off kind of thing. These are week to 10-day long measurements. So these are good solid looks at their energy expenditure in their lifestyle, daily energy expenditures are no different for for Schwarz children and for children in industrialized populations. So no difference against fat-free mass or in more complex statistical models. Okay, well, that's two populations, the Hadza and the Schwarz. What about other groups? And so I'll just show this. Oh, sorry, actually, I want to talk about this first. So that was a comparison between populations, rural Schwarz and industrialized populations. And this is what this looked like in sort of bar chart form. Higher resting energy expenditure for the Schwarz, REE is resting energy expenditure in this graph, but total top line energy expenditures are the same. But of course, when we do these kind of comparisons, we'd like to compare within populations, not across, because when we look across populations, there's so many differences in culture and lifestyle, diet, et cetera, that it can be hard to pinpoint any one thing, or perhaps there's genetic involvement here that we can't capture in these comparisons across populations. And so Sam was actually able to go back in the second year of his postdoc with me and measure energy expenditures in Schwarz children who are living in towns, because the Schwarz are a relatively large population, several thousand Schwarz folks in that part of Ecuador. And some communities live in and around towns. And so we'll call those the urban Schwarz, even though it's not quite urban. But if we look at those groups, right, those children who have access to more market foods, right, they can buy their foods at the market rather than getting wild foods. For example, they're more integrated into town life. They have a somewhat intermediate resting energy expenditures between rural and industrialized US. But look at this. The top line energy expenditures, there's no difference in total daily energy expenditure between any of these three groups, even though resting energy expenditure goes down as we go from rural Schwarz to industrialized. And the urban Schwarz is somewhat intermediate, but the total energy expenditure at the top is no different. However, their body fats are different. So the body fats percentages in these urban or sort of peri-urban Schwarz children looks more like industrialized children, even though energy expenditures are no different. Total expenditures aren't any different. And that is strong evidence, I think, that as populations go through this transition from very rural and remote and traditional lifestyles to more urban industrialized lifestyles, what's changing body fat percentages, for example, and other aspects of our cardiometabolic health is not energy expenditure, that stays the same, but instead something to do with the energy that we bring in, diet, which I'll talk about towards the end of the talk today. Okay, so what about other populations? Well, here's the Chimani. They are ecologically similar population to the Schwarz. They live in a similar environment in Bolivia, actually. A culturally different group, but the way they make a living in terms of fishing and foraging and farming is quite similar. Well, I'm going to show you this data in a little bit of a different way. Here's physical activity measured with accelerometry or other objective measurements. This is minutes a day of moderate and vigorous physical activity. Hadza men and Chimani men, Hadza and Chimani women. And I've taken other industrialized populations and they are rank ordered by their level of activity. So this is objectively measured activity with an accelerometer or some other objective measurement of minutes a day of physical activity. And of course, if physical activity was a strong predictor of daily energy expenditure, then if I showed you a graph of their daily energy expenditure like this, it would be it would look the same. It would just have different units. Rather than minutes a day of activity, it would be calories a day or joules a day of expenditure. But actually, when we look at expenditures, they don't look like activity levels. Daily expenditures don't correspond to activity levels for the Hadza and Chimani, or for that matter, for any of the gray populations, the industrialized populations here that are rank ordered on the left, but of course are jumbled on the right. So we can say really clearly then that physically active populations do not spend more energy per day than more sedentary populations. That's a huge surprise, and it tells us that daily energy expenditure does not predict how many calories you burn every day, that something else is going on. I should say too that it's not just in humans, that when we look across another work that I do, as an anthropologist, I also look at energy expenditures in our primate relatives. And if we look at total energy expenditures against body mass for primates, these are each dot here is a population. So it's a population of a non-primate mammal like a rodent or a carnivore or an ungulate. or in yellow here, are the primate populations. And some of these primate populations were measured in captivity, in zoos or labs. Some were measured in the wild. And there's no difference between the energy expenditure of primates in captivity or in the wild. So it's not just humans. All primates, and in fact, even more broadly, all mammals seem to be following this pattern that your lifestyle does not dictate how many calories you burn every day. Physically active populations don't burn more energy every day than more sedentary groups. Those are population comparisons. What if we impose exercise on somebody? What if we change their lifestyle? And that kind of study has been done a lot in rodents and birds, and actually in humans too, if we think about exercise intervention studies. And I know you can't read the axes there, that's okay. Every x-axis here is physical activity, every y-axis is daily energy expenditure, and every panel is a study. And as you can see, sorry about that. Oh, there we go. As you can see, the top line here, there's no relationship between how active we are and how many calories we burn. That's when we take a bird, or we take a rodent, or we take a person, and we change their lifestyle and make them more and more physically active. Daily energy expenditure actually plateaus. It stays the same. And here's a nice study of that more recently, showing this in mice. If this is Kevin Hall's group at the NIH. If you take a group of mice, you don't let them have any access to a running wheel, and you measure their energy expenditure, their activity is low. And that in blue here is total energy expenditure. You give them access to a wheel, and they get more and more and more and more physically active over the 3 weeks. But after a sort of a period of adjustment, daily energy expenditure is a plateau. It does not change. And so there's no correspondence between daily activity and daily energy expenditure. Oh, there we go. That's the highlight I thought I was going to have earlier. Okay, so here's to sort of spotlight a human study that does this, that's changed daily energy activities, that has changed daily activities and looked at energy expenditure response. I'll talk about two that have been done really well. Here's Midwest Study 1, which was done in 1999 and 2000. A 16-month study. People were required to exercise 20,000 kilocalories a week. That's the equivalent of running about 20 miles a week, or I guess that's about 35 kilometers a week. And here's what we could expect then. If you get this many calories a week of exercise, here's how much your daily expenditure should increase based on that exercise expenditure. And when we measure energy expenditures at 16 months, here's what we see. There's actually no difference, that the trend is positive, but there's so much variation in response that there's no significant relationship. There's no significant difference, I should say, in daily energy expenditures between baseline and at 16 months. This was redone in a study called Midwest 2. They exercised it for either 2,000 kilocalories a week or 30,000 kilocalories a week. So that's either imposing about 20 miles a week of running or 30 miles a week of running, right? It's a lot of exercise. And again, black is what we would expect to happen to their daily energy expenditures, and green is what we observe. In the 2,000 kilocalorie a week group, again, there was actually no difference between baseline and at 10 months, their daily energy expenditure, P.1, no difference. There was an increase for the higher expenditure group. However, in both groups, even the mean expenditure was about 33% lower than we'd expect. The change was 33% lower than we'd expect based on the imposed exercise. So they're sort of compensating, they're adjusting by about 33% of what we'd expect from the imposed exercise expenditure. This has been looked at in different ways in Midwest 2. They've split this group up in different ways and looked at different cohorts. So for example, if you look at those who lost a lot of weight, we call them responders, versus those who didn't. Those who didn't lose weight seem to have increased their expenditure much less. Right? So non-responders, quote unquote, those who don't lose weight in response to exercise, may perhaps not surprisingly, don't really change their energy expenditure in response to exercise. They've also looked at this in terms of, did you exercise early in the day, late in the day, or was it variable? And the amount of compensation we see with the time of day that they exercise is variable as well. And so what I did is I went to their papers that they've published, and I used these cohorts. I looked at the amount of energy compensation that we see with these cohorts. In other words, how this green bar differs from the expected black bar. So I've looked at energy compensation against how much weight was lost in each of these cohorts, sort of a rough reanalysis of their data. And it looks something like this. If you sort of plot their cohorts in this space, what you find is that the compensation actually corresponds with the weight loss. Now, this isn't a proper analysis. These aren't independent data points. These are different ways of looking at the same study. So what needs to be done is a reanalysis of this data set, or a similar analysis, a similar study that would look at this more carefully. But to me, it suggests there's something important here going on, that energy compensation is a variable response when we impose lifestyle changes, and that it seems to predict body weight loss in response to exercise. And I think that could be one of the reasons that when we look across exercise studies, we actually don't see over the long term much weight loss from exercise alone. So here is a meta-analysis looking at 63 studies, 67 cohorts, 928 subjects. And most studies last only a couple of months. And if you only have a study that lasts a couple of months, then the response is really variable. But as studies get longer and longer and bodies have time to adjust, weight loss actually approaches zero, and from exercise alone. In fact, the long-term expected weight loss for about over a year to 2 years is about 2 kilograms from weight loss from exercise alone. So this is well known. This is not my work. This is data from other studies. Exercise is a poor tool for weight loss, and I think energy expenditure compensation, what I was showing you before, is a big reason why. Intake likely changes as well. How much you eat likely changes as well. But I think the expenditure side of this is important to consider as well. Now, if exercise isn't changing your energy expenditure as much as we'd like, right, that might frustrate weight loss, and it might make us ask, well, then why bother exercising? And what I want to emphasize is that you still need to exercise. What I want to emphasize is that exercise is still really, really important. And actually, this energy compensation might be a big reason why. So if we think about it this way, we have two people here who are both relatively sedentary. This person changes their lifestyle on the right? And for a while, after they change their lifestyle, they start that new exercise regime. Their energy expenditure goes up. And so total energy expenditure goes up for a while. And perhaps they'll see some weight loss, which is great. But after a while, the body's going to adjust. And it's going to clamp back down. And daily energy expenditure, the total number, the top line here, will be similar to what it was before. But look what's happened. We've changed the way we spend our calories. We're spending less energy on other stuff because we're spending more energy on activity. And that reduced expenditure on other stuff might be one of the reasons exercise is so good for us, okay? It might be one of the reasons that exercise reduces inflammation, reduces stress reactivity, and puts our reproductive hormones in a healthier place. And we've known for a long time that exercise can do this. So if we look at people who exercise not very much, a bit, or a lot, these are US adults, the level of elevated inflammation levels measured by C-reactive protein goes down. So people who exercise a lot have lower inflammation levels. People who exercise a lot here, right? This is the years of endurance training in men. Their testosterone levels are really high if you don't exercise at all. But after a few years of endurance training, these are cross-sectional data, I should emphasize that. But men who have been at endurance training, running for 2 to 5 to 10 years, have lower and probably healthier testosterone levels at baseline than men who don't exercise at all. And interestingly, that level of testosterone is actually what we see in groups like the Hadza and other traditional physically active populations. This, too, I want to emphasize, shows us how long this adjustment period might last, right? Most exercise studies last a year or two and might not show very big adjustments. People who have been exercising for longer might still be adjusting, and it might not reach sort of stable equilibrium until you've been in that lifestyle for a few years. Stress reactivity, right? So if we look at people who are exercising versus not, this is a crossover study in women. They were either in a sedentary portion of the study, or they were exercising in the study at 30 minutes of jogging a day, 5 days a week. And their 24-hour production of cortisol and epinephrine, these two hormones that are released in response to stress, was 30% lower when they were exercising. And that's not, there wasn't that much exercise. It wasn't intense, but even moderate exercise was enough to bring down stress reactivity. And we know that inflammation and stress are strongly related to the development of disease, especially as we age. And so these might be really important reasons that exercise is so good for us, that these adjustments our body makes frustrate weight loss, but actually help maintain health, particularly as we age. So, exercise is really important. It can also help us maintain weight loss if we're able to lose it. It can help us maintain our strength and weight and maintain our lean mass as we exercise or as we lose weight with dietary changes. So exercise is really important here. But I think the reasons why are perhaps different than we're often told. Okay. So traditional groups like the Hadza are really physically active. Okay. They get a lot of activity. They don't spend more energy every day than industrialized groups. And so that adjustment, I think, is an important thing to consider. What about diet? I'll just go through this quickly. Diets in traditional groups are really diverse. So this is about 3 years of observations with the Hadza, and you can see how much meat is in the diet. It really changes week to week, month to month. Okay, so anybody telling you that there's one ancestral diet or one traditional diet, it doesn't work that way. Diets are actually quite diverse in how much meat and how many plants they get and macronutrients as well. If we zoom in on this year of observations, where a lot of other data were collected, we can see that even within that year, month to month, we have a lot of variation in the kinds of foods: tubers, berries, baobab fruits, meat, honey. Honey is a huge part of the Hadza diet. The contributions of those parts of the diet to total calorie intake is really variable, even over the course of months. If we look across populations, right, this is 260 traditional populations. This is how far they live away from the equator. 0 is at the equator or towards the poles. And we can see populations who live in really cold climates don't eat many plants. No surprise there. But populations that live in temperate and tropical climates eat a really big mix of foods. There is no one traditional diet, and it certainly isn't a high meat diet. Okay. So, we've changed our diets a lot with farming and with industrialization. This is a look at corn, for example, or maize, how we've changed it with farming. We've made plant foods lower in fiber, higher in energy. We've made the animals we eat higher in fat. This is how much energy you get from fat in domesticated cattle and pigs versus what wild animals look like in terms of the energy from fat and for a given size animal. We've changed how much fat domesticated animals have. We've also increased how much saturated fat they have. And then with industrialization, of course, we've changed our food environments completely. And we've done some really crazy things. First of all, we have foods over here that are just way more energy dense than anything that a Hadza person would encounter. And we've also flipped this ecological rule on its head, where the foods that are easiest to buy are the most energy dense. So, traditional diets are diverse. Industrialized diets are perverse, and I think that's a reason that we have such an obesity issue. Again, this idea that paleo diets, the true ancestral diets, were high fat. This is what we're often told. If we actually look at traditional diets, they don't look like that at all. So this idea that traditional diets are somehow low carb just doesn't fit with the data. I just want to make that point. They do have a lot of fiber, however, and the fiber is another thing that we might want to try to get into our industrialized diets today. Okay, so that's just a quick run through diet, the energy intake part of the story. And what we see is that traditional diets are diverse. There's more fiber, less energy, and importantly, they're unprocessed. And I think that we should focus on those aspects of diet if we want to try to manage our weight more effectively. With that, I'll say thank you to the Hadza and Schwarz and Chimani. And again, my funders and my collaborators. And if you're interested in this material, please check out the book, Burn. Thank you.
Thanks, Herman. That was really interesting. Just before we start, we're going to let the show, can you hang on an extra 10 minutes or so? Shall we have some time to talk?
I can. I'm sorry. Yeah.
All right.
Sorry if I went over.
I didn't want to stop you because I wanted to hear, I think people wanted to hear about the diet data because, the paleo diet, craze is still out there. And a lot of people ask me those questions too. Maybe we could take a step back more to the beginning of the talk to begin with, though. And you talked about a reduction in chronic diseases like metabolic diseases, cardiovascular diseases. Is that true across the board? Is there data on neurodegenerative diseases and other kinds of things? And what do people in this population die from?
Yeah. So, well, the second part of that's much easier. So, infectious disease, acute infections, respiratory infections are the number one source of mortality by far. Neurodegenerative diseases are harder to assess. We don't see evidence of that, but a lot of those, Alzheimer's dementia, for example, would require someone there with medical expertise to diagnose it, and isn't an easy diagnosis to make in the field. And so we don't know, I don't have great data for you on prevalence. What I can tell you is it seems to be quite low. We don't see evidence for it. Dave Reichland and colleagues are trying to get a better handle on that now, but as far as we can tell, it's low, very low prevalence.
I think that's perhaps not surprising, because one of the things that have jumped out of the exercise studies, and I'm glad you reemphasized the importance of exercise here. It's like, but one of the things that have jumped out of the exercise studies is that cognitive diseases or neurodegenerative diseases are decreased dramatically as well, which I think was a surprise. In that kind of research, everybody expected the metabolic disease changes, but not the Alzheimer's, for instance. I think it's fascinating because how much. One thing you didn't mention about the diet, how are like the Hadza eating the same amount of calories? How much less calories are they eating a day?
Well, so, when we do these energy expenditure measurements, we always check that their weight's stable during those periods, right? Yeah. And they are. I mean, their weight's stable for years. So then in that case, energy expenditure is also giving us a pretty good, accurate measurement of how many calories are coming in on average. Now, those are going to, those day-to-day will not quite be in sync, right? Just like in our daily lives, if you measure yourself every morning, you're going to see slight fluctuations. But on average, those energy intakes are also at that same level.
Yeah, I think, so if you're burning the same amount of calories every day, or same amount of energy expenditure at least, and one group is exercising a lot and the other group is not exercising, where are the people not exercising burning the calories? Is it a different place in the body? How is that affecting metabolism?
Yeah, well, so that's what I, trying to get at with the inflammation and stress reactivity kind of data. And that's something we're digging down on now. Our hypothesis is that there's sort of two elements here. One is that there are probably behavioral changes. So, things like fidgeting and that kind of stuff are probably happening less in the Hadza versus in populations like ours. But I think also, you have these high levels of inflammation, you have high stress reactivity, you have sky high reproductive hormones in a lot of industrialized populations. Mm-hmm. And those are all energy expenditures. Those are all physiological activities that they must cost calories. Nothing's for free. And you kind of don't need to do them. And so I think that's one of the reasons they have because you can flip the question on its head, right? Why do we have high expenditures, basically? And I think those are what our body's doing that we don't need to do, that are higher than they are in the Hadza and other groups like that.
Yeah, and so it must be a change in caloric intake too, because we're accumulating a lot of fat while burning the same amount of calories. So, well,
certainly the food that's coming in is higher, and I mean you can track that nicely. So Kevin Hall's done nice work looking at if you feed someone a processed food diet versus unprocessed foods. Yeah. On processed foods, people they regulate intake poorly. They don't mean to, of course, none of it's intentional, but you gain a pound a week. Kilogram every 2 weeks if you are on a highly processed diet versus not. And so, the intake side of it is where people are going wrong with obesity.
So you must get asked all the time about whether paleo diet's healthy or not. And I think one of the points you mentioned is key right there, is that low carbohydrate is not necessarily bad. What's bad is high processed sugars and lots of fruits have high carbohydrate content. They typically have more complex carbohydrates. So I'm assuming that the hunter-gatherers are getting more of their carbohydrates from fruits and things.
They are. So they get berries, which are not as sugar rich even as ours are, and low. Those are higher fiber fruits. They do get a lot. 10 to 15% of their diet every day on average is honey, which is just sugar and water.
Yeah.
But I think you're right that, they're doing that along with a lot of fiber from tubers, for example. The tubers eat are really fibrous, the berries as well. And it's just, it isn't engineered in a lab to be hyper palatable and, low satiation. I mean, the foods that we buy in a supermarket are typically engineered and literally focus group tested to make sure that you eat a lot. That's how the food companies make money, right? I mean, I don't think it's malicious, but I think that, that's their job, is to sell you lots of food. And so, I don't think we should be surprised when we buy a lot of food and you can't eat it. That's what it is.
So these hunter-gatherers must be much more efficient when they're exercising too, right? I mean, if they have
you would think so, right? That's one of the interesting things. We've measured walking energy expenditures, for example. We've measured, we set up a track around camp, a nice level track, and we had them wear a Cosmed respirometry system, a wearable one, and their energy of walking is the same. The energy spent per kilometer, per kilogram is the same. So the muscle efficiency isn't changing very much, if at all. We don't see any evidence for that at all. So I don't know that it's more efficient. I think they're changing what they do, not how many calories it takes to do it.
Yeah, it's amazing that they stay so active that late in life. I mean, if you plotted that data for Western populations, it would look a lot different, I think. And
absolutely. Yeah, no, it would. And it falls off, in later decades of life, 50s, 60s, 70s, people really seem to change, on average, how active they're getting. And we know that's a really big, it's a big health issue, and it's a big predictor of longevity and healthy longevity. And we, I can tell you go out, when we're there, we spend the days with them, going out foraging, and you see Hadza women. I've spent my share of days like trying to keep up with Hadza grandmothers, and they're really, it's so heartening to see, because they're just out there really getting after it and moving and fast, and keeping up with the younger women, and it's cool to see.
What about the concept of fasting? We also talk about fasting is healthy for long lifespan, and there's speculation that there was a lot of sort of fasting by necessity in some hunter-gatherer cultures. I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, is there a fasting component in anymore? And
yeah, I mean, they certainly aren't trying to fast, and and they always, it's kind of amazing, because as sort of scarce and barren as that landscape can look to somebody like me, right? It looks like a lot of grass and a lot of acacia trees, which you can't eat either of those things. But they look at that landscape and they see food everywhere. And they never seem to be, I've never been at a Hadza camp where there's no food. And, they can always get more tubers. They can usually get more honey and berries and stuff. And, game is variable depending on the hunter's luck, but everything else seems to be really stable. So, do they eat as often as we do? I don't know. We actually want to measure meal timing there next. We haven't been able to go back because of COVID, but they aren't doing the kind of long fasting or sort of regularized, fasting that you see people doing, that's popular now. And again, that might be a great way to help cut calories, and people have good success with that. So I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but they don't seem to do it.
Yeah. It would be good to go back and look at, number of meals a day, what times, things like that. That would be, I think, because now there's even data that things like eating during a 12-hour window each day can be healthy. And that may be the case if there's no electricity there. So it's,
I should say, it's funny when you go there, they don't have clocks or calendars, and their concept, they understand time just fine. But they don't track it the same way that we do. I'm watching my clock go minute by minute, second by second here, and I've got things scheduled, and I know what I did yesterday and what I'm going to do tomorrow. And, my life is very structured and scheduled that way. But theirs isn't. So if you say, hey, what did you eat today? They'll be like, well, let me think about that. It's sort of, they don't keep track because it's not relevant. So, anyway, it's kind of fun to have that, to realize how much, how different people's, the way they structure their day can be.
I wasn't aware of these Midwest studies. I mean, how do you get people to burn that many or that much energy? That's a pretty motivated people participating in those studies. I run 20 miles a week, and it's a lot of work to do that.
It is. And I mean, of course, the people are compensated. They're paid to participate. And they have a lot of dropouts, actually. I don't know what a lot is, but 20% dropout rate would not be surprising at all in a study like that, just because, like you say, it's so intense. So it is hard, to keep people in, and that's why the number of studies that have done this are so few. That graph of weight loss versus how long the study lasts. All the studies are 5 months long or even 2 months long because it's really hard to get this done. And I think that's one of the values of these, population studies and ecological studies. If somebody like me doing this kind of work with the Hadza, I don't have the same kind of experimental control as I'd love to have. On the other hand, these are folks who have had this lifestyle for their lives for years and years, right? And so that's you're looking at a different amount of adjustment, right, than you are if you're looking at people recruited for a study who do it for 2 months.
It would be interesting.
And I think since we want to fix these things long term, we don't want to fix your issues for a month. We want to fix your issues for the rest of your life. I think these long-term studies, ecological studies, are really important.
I'm not sure you could do this, but it'd be interesting to know what would happen if you did a study where you had the Hadza go to a non-exercise for a period of time and see what the metabolic changes are. That might break ethical rules.
Yeah, I don't know how we would do it. I'll say that, again, that's why I like the study that Sam did so much with the Schwarz children. Yeah. They're becoming more urbanized. They're being a bit less active. And you see them going through that transition that all of our, a lot of our Western cultures and industrialized cultures have gone through. And you can watch that, track that change. And those children are gaining fat, right? But they're not burning fewer calories. It's the same. But again, the way they're spending those calories is different. They're gaining fat, probably for dietary reasons. And so that's where I think that there's utility there. But you're right. It would be the thought experiment of what would happen to a Hadza man or woman moved to, Singapore would be interesting.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'm going to bring Jorming Go in. He's directing our clinical studies here in US, but he's also an exercise physiologist. And I know he has a number of interesting questions tonight. And there's also a large number of audience questions. So we're going to take a little extra time and try to get to what we can. Jorming?
Thanks very much, Brian. And thanks very much, Herman, for the very illuminating talk. I'm going to start with some of the questions from the audience. I think there's been a very large response, and not even sure if we could get through all of them today, but I'll try to summarize, okay? So we have a question from Siti Zubaida, and she was asking about intermittent fasting amongst this group, which was kind of following up on what Brian said. As you know very well, the hunter-gatherers, they probably present with the thrifty gene, hypothesis that has been discussed, where they go through cyclical natures of feasting and fasting. But at least that's at least 15, 20,000 years ago. But I guess from your experience of the Hadza tribe, do they also go through that kind of, cyclical nature of feast and famine? And the reason I ask that is because for a lot of the studies being done in the geroscience field, we do see that intermittent fasting or even just fasting in general does improve lifespan and health span.
Yeah, great question. So first, the thrifty gene hypothesis, that's an interesting idea. I don't know that we have good evidence for the sort of the way that was presented initially. So in the 1960s, James Neal said, thrifty gene hypothesis is one idea for why these groups that transition, tend to have issues with obesity and metabolic disease. But when we look for obesity-related genes, for thrifty genes, now we can do GWAS and that kind of stuff. We don't see, in these populations, particular evidence of a gene or a constellation of genes that are responsible here for this. And so I think that what we're seeing with the Hadza would be true of any of us, right? Any population globally. I don't think it's a particular population by population issue. And, in terms of the boom and bust availability of food, again, every population on the planet, all humans were hunting and gathering until 10,000 years ago. And so I think we would all be subject to the same kind of boom and bust in our history. And so, does intermittent fasting kind of reflect that same kind of cyclical thing that was happening earlier? I don't know. There's an argument to be made that food shortages can be more common in farming, actually, because if farming, you have all of your eggs in one basket, right? You all have all of your food environment your food portfolio is all one thing. And if the crops don't come in that year, then you have a real problem. Whereas hunting and gathering groups actually have a diverse set of foods they can eat. And if one kind of food isn't available this year, then the other foods are. Either way, intermittent fasting does work for a lot of people. And as far as I can tell, the evidence is that, at least with weight, body weight, intermittent fasting works because it's one way that people are able to reduce calorie intake. And so if you have intermittent fasting without calorie restriction, you don't see the same effects as if you have, if you're using it to sort of restrict your calories. And yes, restricting calories does seem to help with longevity. Intermittent fasting is one way to get there. So that's how I see it. I don't see it as anything sort of magical about intermittent fasting particularly, but it can be a really effective way to reduce calorie intake for a lot of people.
That's very interesting, Herman. Thank you. Since we're on the topic of calories intake, one of the questions from the audience was the way you normalize your data. For example, this person, Wieland Sim, mentioned that you were normalizing energy expenditure for fat-free mass. And the question is, if you were to compare that with an industrialized person that, let's say has the same energy expenditure per day, but then obviously would have a much higher fat mass rather than fat-free mass, would that actually be much different? Because then you're partitioning energy towards the fat mass rather than fat-free mass.
Yeah, great question. So just, again, when we do those analyses, I show the graphs of expenditure against fat-free mass because that's the easiest way to see it. But of course, when we run the models, we include fat mass or body. We can do it different ways. We can do it as fat mass, do it as fat percentage. And so we run the models in different ways. And we see the same results basically. Fat is not metabolically quiet, but fat's doing, produces hormones. So there are things that fat's doing that burn calories, but it's such a small contributor that when you add fat to the models, it doesn't really change the outcomes much because fat doesn't predict energy expenditure very well, just because it's a relatively quiet tissue. But you're right that if you include, if you do it versus total body weight, the graphs would look a little bit different because of that effect of fat on the x-axis, basically kind of pushing your x-axis around. But once you account for body composition and stuff like that, there's no difference. But yeah, good question. I mean, there's a lot more fat activity in your typical American, for example, because we have a lot more fat that's producing hormones and that kind of stuff, but it's not changing the energy expenditure very much.
What is the percent fat content in this population? I mean, I know it's less, but how much less?
Yeah. Men are in their teens. Women are in their 20s fat percentage. So, healthy, but not high.
So very lean, in other words. So I guess, on the same vein with fat partitioning, a lot of your data actually showed absolute rates of energy expenditure where you presented them as total energy expenditure. And I know in ecological studies like this, it's very difficult to get dietary intake data, right? So if we were to account for dietary intake data, you would actually get perhaps like a mean energy expenditure minusing of the energy expenditure or energy intake data. So in other words, if you were to compare relative energy expenditure between those populations and with more industrialized populations, I think maybe that's where you get to see the exceptional health benefits. Would you say that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what you have in the US, for example, where people are slowly gaining weight on average, and it doesn't happen, equally across the year. People have people gaining weight during the holidays and coming back down. They gain weight during the next holiday, but never comes quite all the way back down, right? There's sort of ratchet effect where it goes up and up and up in a kind of step-like manner. Those are, I think, clearly mismatches between expenditure and intake. And the question for a long time has been, well, is the problem the expenditure or is the problem the intake? And I think here we can see that very strongly it's the intake side, that people are overeating, not intentionally, of course, nobody's trying to, but it's the foods that we eat, I think, push us to overconsume.
Yeah, and COVID didn't help that either. So.
Right. Well, and stress eating is a real thing, right? When people are stressed out or unhappy, often food is used as the sort of a way to kind of feel better, and not consciously, but people do that. And so, people might have been less active during COVID, which doesn't help. But I think also eating more.
So I'm going to kind of go to the next topic, Herman, and I'm going to ask a question. Okay. So The question from Diogo is, what does an activity bout or hunting session actually look like? Is it more continuous aerobic exercise, or is it more interval training? And related to that, how intense are these kinds of activities? And this kind of brings me to the point, even though they're physically active, they're kind of moderately active. Well, the intensity is moderate, right? Yeah. Now, compared to people in the industrialized society, we spend a lot of time doing exercise training, so that's going to be more vigorous to higher intensity. Mm-hmm. Do things actually kind of even out in the long run, or do you think it's actually more beneficial for populations to be moderately active, right, rather than to have accumulation of bouts of highly vigorous activities?
Yeah, gosh, I would love to know the answer to that question. As far as I can tell, it's sort of the total number of calories that you're burning in your exercise, right? And if you get that with high intensity interval training in a short amount of time, or aerobic activity over a longer period of time, right now, I'm not sure that there's a big difference in the way that that's going to affect metabolism. It'll affect things like muscle growth, for example. So there are other aspects, but in terms of calorie expenditure, I'm not sure right now that it has a big effect. But we just don't know. So I'd love to see work on that. In terms of what the Hadza do, it's a lot of walking, right? Walking, and they walk fast. So it isn't just sort of, lazy walking. They're really moving when they go. They don't run. So, in some populations, men especially, but even women will run to track down game, to get animals. But we don't see that with the Hadza. They just walk and walk and walk. Men climb into trees to get honey, and they chop into the tree, and women are often digging in the ground to get tubers. So there's also some more intense work that way. But the typical thing is just lots of fast walking.
So I have a question from two different members of the audience. One more was from Diogo Barado, and the other one was from Suinai Go. The question is, do hunter-gatherers actually exhibit sarcopenia or dynapedia at older age? And related to that, what is their frailty status? What does it look like when they get much older? Is it kind of very similar to? Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's right. Great questions. Their frailty seems to be low. They don't seem to become frail at old age. Now, it's hard to do like a 6-minute walk test out there, but we do have body composition data, and the amount of age-related sarcopenia. There might be a sort of a trend there, but it's not as strong as we see in the industrialized world. People don't sort of fall off, the sarcopenia graphs as strongly. So, I think it's actually a good model for how you maintain muscle mass and maintain, vitality and strength in these populations. Absolutely.
So there's just the rate of infectious disease goes up in old age, I assume. And
it does. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
How well treated is it? Or do they get treatment for this, or is it?
So one of the things that we do as to partner with them and to kind of give back is we run, we call it the bush ambulance. So, if people get really sick, they can call or send word. Say, they can't usually call, but they can send word, and we'll send a Land Rover to get them and try to get them to a health clinic. We've started that in the last few years, and that's helped a lot. We hope. But in general, no. If you have, a respiratory infection, if you're a kid or an adult, you just kind of try to ride it out. And that's one of the reasons that there's such high mortality with children, is that they often can't get to a clinic. If they can get out to a clinic, it can be a couple of days walking to get there, which makes it hard if you're really sick to get there. Yeah. But if you can get there, then there are, people who have antibiotics, for example, would be pretty easy to get access to if you can get to the village.
Yeah, because you might expect them to have a strong immune system too.
I would think so.
Yeah. Based on, number one, a lot of exposure, but also just the exercise supports that too. So it's really a treatment effect. And I guess what I'm asking in the long run is, do they have compressed morbidity? In other words, the period of time when they have, disease at the end of life that really is debilitating, is that reduced? I would guess yes, but
that's my impression. I don't think we've studied that. Anybody in our group has studied that specifically, but that would be a great kind of way to ask that question and focus on that next.
WHO has kind of changed the guidelines in the past 6 months, I believe, when they came out and suggested that in addition to the minimum 150 minutes a week, they now recommend between 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity that people should undertake for each week to improve health span. So a related question to that from David Fan was, how would you actually implement a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, in a modern society? And do you think it's realistic?
That's a big question. I do think we have to try. I think it becomes realistic if we consider how we engineer our lifestyles, right? I mean, our day-to-day lives right now didn't happen by accident. We built them, right? We built our cities and we built our transportation and we built our buildings. And so, it didn't happen to us. Somebody, a group of us, engineered these lifestyles that we live in right now. And so why couldn't we engineer a more active lifestyle? I think we absolutely can. And I think we have to try. I think the way that you would do it, if you want to bring these principles home, is you would build a lifestyle where you're physically active throughout the day, that you're not just going to the gym for 45 minutes at the end of your work day or before you go to work, right? That's great. And if you can do that, that's wonderful. But there's so many reasons that, I can't go to the gym today, or I'm too busy or whatever. And then you stop. And what needs to happen is, I think that would be more effective is we design our cities, we design our worlds in a way that encourages physical activity throughout the day. So more walkable cities, right? More walkable buildings, right? And I think that those would be a great way to kind of get a hunter-gatherer elements back into our lives.
Turn off the elevators.
Yeah.
Jorming, is there one more question?
Well, maybe I'll just conclude by saying, next time you're doing your field trip out to Tanzania, maybe we could send you some, collection tubes, and then we could start measuring some biologic markers of aging, and then compare them with some of the active populations here, and see if there are differences and things that we could actually glean from in your field studies.
I'd love that. If you have collection markers that fit, can handle living in the back of a Land Rover for a month, we'd love to do it. We can sometimes put things on liquid nitrogen out there too, so there's a possibility. But if it's small and you can take it camping, we'd love to implement it.
Well, forget that, Jorming. I'm going to send myself. It sounds like an exciting thing to go do. I mean, I'm in the lab all the time, or I used to be. Now I just beg for money at computers. But it sounds like an exciting type of research. It must be fun to go do that.
Oh man, I feel so lucky to have a chance to do it. It is really fun, and I just want to emphasize how amazing that Hadza population, the people are. They're so gracious. Imagine somebody showing up at your door and saying, "Hey, uninvited, unannounced, but I'd like to live here for a month or so, in your garden, and just measure what you eat." I mean, who would put up with that? But they're always so gracious and wonderful, and you learn so much about what life can be like in a very different culture that way. It's they're great.
It's extra benefits of controlling your testosterone. Well, anyway, thanks a lot for joining the show. It was really fun, and I think the audience will get a lot from it. It's very different from our normal shows, and so hopefully we can have you come back in the future at some point. And thanks again.
Thank you.
So I want to remind you, there's the panelists and all attendees button in the chat box to leave comments and feedback on the show. Next, we're going to have Sergey Young, who's the founder of the Longevity Vision Fund. So we're going to go back into the investment space around aging and longevity. And I'm going to leave you tonight with some thoughts on what to do after you retire. Thanks a lot.
We want people to die young, as late in life as possible.
My name is Yan King. I'm 70 years young. After my retirement in 2010, I started to get into Tai Chi. I just enjoy all the movements. Now I can become a teacher to teach other seniors. Don't be afraid of getting old. Retirement is a landmark. There's a long time after your retirement for you to enjoy your life.
I'm feeling like sunshine, like springtime. like something's in the water and I'm taking a deep dive. I'm feeling so weightless, like I'm gonna make it, and nothing in the universe can take this. I can see it clearly now, nothing gonna bring me down.